Now let's continue onward with our switchport configuration example. So at this point, we are generating the VLAN config from a Jinja 2 template. We have Napalm generating the diff. We could easily push that VLAN configuration to 1 or 4 of the Arista switches. Now let's move on to the switchport configuration. So we have two cases here. We have case 1, where we have an access VLAN. So in this case, VLAN 700, which is already configured on this because I could see it up at the top. And then we also have the trunk case where we have switchport mode trunk and switchport trunk allowed VLAN. Here I'm just going to say, well, we could say all, one case. You could also say, like 1 700 or whatever's allowed. Now I don't have the 701 through 706 configured, so right now I'll just say all. And you also have your native VLAN, and here I'll just say 1. Now I recommend to you when you're trying to work out the template that you go and actually do the configs on the device. There are variations that you get into. I'm sure you guys are well aware of this. Sometimes you remember the syntax from platform 1 and then you're actually trying to push it using a template from a different platform. Like, for example, you remember the Arista syntax and it's slightly different on NXOS and you try to push it to NXOS, things like that. So just go and put it on the actual device, a test device. Try to make sure that you have the exact syntax that you want to use for your templating. So I'm going to copy this. Here's what that actually manifested itself to because the others were defaults. Now I'm going to actually copy the non-defaults because I want the syntax of all this. Now we also have the question of what do we want each of these ports 2 through 7 to be configured as. Now here, with the port by port configuration, this to me definitely rings as a switch specific configuration. It probably is not going to be something that would be grouped. Now maybe it is, maybe your patterns are so common that you could have groups of these in some way, in which case definitely put this into group vars. But in this case, I'm going to say this is switch by switch specific, so I'm going to put it in host vars. Now once again, I have to remember the name of this. So we're working on PyNet switch 6. So I'm going to make that host var specific directory, cd into there. So now I am in host vars, the name of the device, and here I'm going to make a switchport.yaml. I'll copy in this text configuration. So this is a YAML file. We specify we're using YAML. Now we're going to need some variable data structure. Now I'm going to go back here and I want to look at the names of the interfaces. So here's my interface name. So we have some variable name. I'm just going to call this ports. Now we know we have Ethernet 2 through 6. So one way we could do this would be through a list of dictionaries. So we could have something like, once again, this is going to be a situation where you're probably going to need to iterate. Take your best shot at your data structure, try to convert it over to the Jinja 2 to generate the output, and if it gets convoluted and a lot of difficulty, think about how can I make it simpler. So here I'm going to have a list of dictionaries, and we'd have each one of these down to port 7. Now we're going to have more than just port name. We'll have mode access or mode trunk. If this is the case of access, we would have access VLAN, and here I'll say he's 700. And then in the trunk case, we'll have native VLAN and something like trunk allowed. Now we have to say what we want for the rest of those ports. I can get rid of, well, I can get rid of this now. I can copy it again if I need it again. So we'll make port 4 be an access port. I'll call this VLAN 705. I'll make port 5 be an access port. Call this VLAN 702. And then I'll make the other two a trunk. And I'll have this one be 701 through 706. And for grins, I'll make this one have a native VLAN of 700. And all he has on him is 700 and 701. Okay, so now we have our variable definition. We've defined all our variables. So now we're going to need to go to our Jinja 2 templating structure. So I want to copy this. Go back in here. We're in our test playbook. So first part we configured our VLANs. Now we're going to have another template where we generate Switchport configs. We'll copy these other items. We'll call this Switchport. We'll call this like sw.text. And we'll just make the gen template tag execute both of them. So now if I go into switchport.j2, paste in this data structure. Now let's go back to our switch exact syntax. This is what we need to be generating, but now from this data structure. So I'm going to copy that in so I have a reference example of it. Then I'm just making it look better. Like what we'd want to have, well, yeah, what we'd want to have for the output config. Now notice we're going to have a little bit of an issue of default values don't show up, but let's put everything we want, and I'm just going to ignore that other part for now. It might make an issue with idempotency, but ultimately we're going to get the correct in-state, which is what fundamentally matters as far as what configuration gets pushed. And then we remember from earlier it's probably 3 spaces. So this is what we want to generate. So once again, we're going to have our Jinja 2 template. We're going to say something like for port in our ports variable. We're then going to say interface. Now here we have to look at what this looks like, the interface name, because we want the canonical name. This capital and then no space. So we'll do variable, and then that is port underscore name. Then enter, then 3 spaces. Now we have to differentiate between, is this a access mode port or a trunk port? So we could say an if condition, if port.mode equals access. Then we're going to do these two lines. Now I haven't put my variables in, but I'll grab those in a minute. And then we'll do elif port.mode equals trunk. And then we'll copy these trunk characteristics. Now we got to say end if, the end of our if statement, and the end of our for loop. Now let's go ahead and make our variables. So this mode here needs to be port.mode. Our VLAN ID needs to be port. And I'm getting all these from looking down at my data structure that I copied in below. Access VLAN. So we're basically variabilizing everything that changes. Port.mode. Trunk allowed VLAN. So here, this has to be a string that it can take in directly. So I'm going to say port.trunk allowed, and then here port.native VLAN. Okay, now let's go ahead and generate our output file and see what we get. Okay, so good. It actually worked. We didn't get any errors there, which easily could have happened. Look at our config. Now we want to make this look as much like what we see in the CLI as possible. One, it makes it much easier for us as network engineers to comprehend. Two, it's going to make it be less, make it more likely to be idempotent when we push it. So now we see problems. We see we have extra spaces here. We see we don't have any exclamation points between the interface sections. So let's go ahead and try to fix some of those problems. So I know from past experience that some of the extra spaces are due to these if statements. We put 3 spaces here before our if statement. Those 3 spaces that we put here are going to come across. So you'd have 3 spaces here, our if statement, and when you got to the next line, you'd have another 3 spaces. So this line would be indented 6. So these if statements, we have to remove those extra spaces. Let's regenerate our template. Look at the output. Okay, so now we at least have our indentation that looks correct. But now let's add our exclamation point between sections. So our for loop is here, our end of our for loop is there. So let's add an exclamation point after each interface. Regenerate our configs. Okay, now we're starting to get pretty close to what we want to look like. I think I actually want a beginning exclamation point, and I already have an end exclamation point. So I'm going to add one more beginning exclamation point. I'm going to put it before we even enter the for loop. Now look at our output file. See what we have. So that's looking correct to me. Now, you might want to actually copy and paste this output into a text switch, because you want to make sure what you're generating actually works correctly. So first we'd have to push out the VLAN changes, then we'd have to push out the port configs. But let's actually, let's actually just go ahead and go into our playbook, copy this. Now we're going to install not the VLANs. Now we have the same diff file. Let's just go ahead and rename the second one temporarily to be the diff file to be that. And let's go ahead and commit our VLAN changes because we know those are fine. And we'll have this one set to not commit. Both cases, we are not doing a configuration replacement. We're just doing a merge. So now we get rid of our tag, execute our playbook. So we're testing our Napalm connectivity, generating the VLAN configs, generating the Switchport configs, installing our VLANs. So those VLAN configs are actually being deployed. Hopefully those are there. This name string is actually wrong. This should be install port parameters or something like that. Now, let's go back to our switch. Look at our VLANs. Those did get deployed. Now we have those previous configurations that we did where we assigned that to 700 and we made this a trunk port. The other ports look right. We go back here and let's look at our diff. Now we're going to look at this SW. Okay, so we're going to configure port 4, port 5, port 6, and port 7. Let's go ahead and deploy that configuration. So we go back into our playbook. We set this to true, re-execute our playbook, and try to deploy it. I forgot to update that name string again, but we can change that after this is done. We see connectivity is good. The templates are all both in the correct state, i.e. they didn't get updated. VLANs are good. They're already in the correct state. Here's our invalid name string. This is what I need to update. Now we're pushing out our switchport configurations. We just did that. We do our show run again. You can see we now have these other ports being configured. And that looks like it matches the spec that we stated. So now we go back in here. I want to go update my name string. Save this.